Hey guys, this is Smithy. Welcome to my channel. Today's video is a very special one. Everybody was waiting for this and here it is. It's not exactly duping one-on-one shades from the Natasha Denona Yucca palette that's recently come out in the market, but it is duping the vibes. If you do have these palettes in your collection, and I have like 6 to 8 palettes that are very similar vibes, that have a very similar vibes to the new palette. So if you guys want to see which palettes, if you do have it in your collection, you don't need to run out and buy the Yucca palette, then please keep on watching. Okay, let's first talk about the first palette that came into my mind, and that is Natasha Denona Mini Gold palette. And I do have this palette with me, not right now, it's back in my hometown. So I am gonna show you a picture on the screen for you guys, and I'll pop pictures on the screen just so that you can see. I don't have exactly all the palettes with me. I just carried like 4 palettes with me, and none of the palettes dupe the vibes. I created this look which vibes the Natasha Denona palette. So if you guys want to see this look in action, I'll pop it in the icons above for you guys to check it out. But the Mini Gold palette, the center shade in the palette is like a duochrome shade, and that so much reminds me of the first shade of the palette, which is like a rosy bronze shade, but it has like a green goldiness to it, and I feel like that center shade completely reminds me of that. But also the matte shade in the palette is also has like the similar vibes of that like olivey green shade. I feel like this could have been like the Yucca palette could have been like the midi size gold palette, and nobody would have like questioned that, because it feels a very good like extension of the Mini Gold palette and like a baby version of the regular gold palette. So that's like my first version to it. Again, the regular gold palette, I feel like that's more neutral leaning with like browns, and this is more like a yellowish olivey leaning palette. Again, I'm not big on like greens or yellows, so I personally feel like I'm not gonna miss out if I do not have that in my collection, again because I do have like orangey yellow leaning shades that I can like create a similar vibes out of it. The second palette that I want to talk about is the newest Nomad palette, which is the Okavango Safari palette. Now Nomad does a lot of palettes with this like grungy murky green color story, but this palette that they came out with, they both came out at like a very similar time frame, like the Natasha Denona palette as well as the Nomad palette, but I feel like they have such similar vibes. Let me just pop it on my screen so that I can see while I'm talking to you guys too. I have my laptop right here. But it does have like that, you know, olivey green shade. It also has that dark tealy green shade that is there in the Yucca palette too. Plus it has that silvery pewter shade that is there in the Natasha Denona palette. I also can see like a deep brown shade. I can definitely see more like golden leaning bronzes and like a lot of green golds. So I feel like this palette definitely would create like a very similar vibes. Now again, the formula would not be similar because Natasha Denona Shimmers is more like that sparkly formula, and Nomad is more like, it's dimensional but is more like a smoother formula. Not saying that one is better than the other, but whatever you feel like is more of your vibe, you like one over the other. Okay, the next palette that came out running to me is the Sigma Earthy eyeshadow palette. Now again, if you have this palette in your collection, you exactly know it's Earthy palette. So it has those like mustardy yellowy brown shades as well as those olivey green shades, and I feel like if you want like a mini 9-pan version of the Natasha Denona palette, this is perfect to have in your collection, and this can completely serve your cravings if you do have it. The next palette, I feel like this would not come out in a lot of people's mind just because of the pop of pinks also in it. But if you see at the Odens Hela palette that was in collaboration with Angelica Nyquist, if you look at the first half of the palette, it's so reminiscent of this Yucca palette with those like bright yellows and those warm tone green shades. I feel like it's just a perfect palette. If you do have that palette, you exactly know what I'm talking about. If I take out like the peaches and the pinks out of that palette, it also has that galaxy shade, like a pewter looking shade also in the palette. It has that deep brown, it has the yellow, it has that green gold, it has that murky green, it even has that teal shade and like orangey leaning peach shade also. I feel like Hela palette, the first 2 rows completely reminds me of that. Even the 3rd row, the first shade in the palette, that also is very reminiscent of it. I feel like first half of the Hela palette, like the first half of the Hela palette completely reminds me of that. And the newest palette that came out from Odens I actually purchased the purple version of it. I do not have it right now. I shipped it back to my place in US. But the green palette, which is the stone, what is that called? Stone and rock? Yes, the stone and the rock palette. Again, it has a very similar vibes to it. Now this palette came before the Yucca palette, so a lot of people were like very interested into the green palette, and it looks absolutely stunning with those like warm tone greens and golds in the palette. I feel like this also would just serve a lot of like craving if you do have it, because again, we are seeing a lot of like murkiness, a lot of oliveness. I feel this palette is more like, if you look at the variety that this is giving, I feel like the Hela palette as well as the stone and the rock palette gives a lot more variety in greens as compared to the new Yucca palette, just because I feel like the Yucca palette mattes are a lot like mid-tone, not like super deep and dark, and all the shimmers look very similar to each other. All of them remind me of like a green gold shade, but like with a tad bit of variation, but on the eyes it's gonna look very similar. I feel like these palettes, they give you a lot more variety on your eyes as compared to the new Yucca palette. Not saying that the Yucca palette is bad by any means, because I love my Natasha Denona palettes and you know that, but I also want to keep a realistic view how I feel about the palette. Okay, let's move on to the next palette. The next palette that came into my mind is the Ace Beauty Tropical Vibes palette, and this had a lot of like hype when it came out. Now this palette, I feel like it's like 2 years old, and this completely has this like yellow and the warm olive tones and green tones in the palette. This can get you so close. And the Tropical Vibes palette retails for like $39, and again it has like 15 shades. You again can find like different amount of shimmers. They don't have a lot of shimmers. It's more like matte heavy palette. So if you like mattes, I feel like this palette can give you so much of variety of looks on your eyes, and this is a very good comparison to the newest palette from Natasha Denona. I feel like this again, warm yellow leaning murky tones and like all like greens and browns. It's all earthy to me. So these palettes are like very reminiscent of each other. The next palette that came into my mind is the Melt Gemini palette. Now again, I own this palette and I use this palette so very much. I really love the quality of the Melt Gemini palettes. And the Melt Original Gemini palette is a mixture of the earthy warm tones mixed with the murky greens. Melt Cosmetics is known for the murkiness, and this is exactly what we are looking for. Now this palette only has like 10 shades. You're seeing like a lot of murkiness, you're seeing like a lot of yellows and mustards and greens in the palette, but again it has like a black which goes so deep that you can like get easily a smoky eye with it, and it has that greeny gold shade, very similar to what I have on my eyes today. I love the quality of this palette, and I can like rank Melt Cosmetics on my top recommended palettes for sure. And the last palette that came into my mind is from Colored Raine, and this is the Safari Raine palette. Again, a mix of yellowy orangey leaning shades, but also with that pewter gray shade and also murky greens and the teal shade. This again I would say like is a condensed version of the Natasha Denona Yucca palette. So these are like ample amount of palettes for you to like search at a lesser price point. You can get very similar vibes on the eyes. I really hope that this video was helpful for you guys, and if you do have these palettes already in your collection, try and put it on your eyes thinking that you're using the Yucca palette, and see how you can like manipulate your mind saying that you don't need to like run out and buy it. My kids are screaming, and yeah, the house is not insulated, so you would always hear them screaming. But that's all for today, guys. If you did like it, you know what to do. Do give it a thumbs up, and also subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell so that you're notified every time that I post next. I generally upload 3 videos every single week, every Tuesdays, Thursdays and Saturdays at 9 AM Eastern Standard Time. Until next time, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye guys.